right, I think we're about ready to get started with the next panel. Everybody, thank you all for being here. Thanks for coming to Howard Days. Everybody having a good time so far at Howard Days? All right. Thank you. So for those who don't know me, my name is Jeffrey Shanks. I'm an archaeologist by day and Howard nerd by, well, night and day, I guess. This has become a big part of my life and what I do over the years. Probably more than some fans, I've really delved into the scholarly side of Howard and helping to promote Howard in the academic world over the last 6, 7, 8 years. With giving papers and at academic conferences like the Popular Culture Association National Conference, the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts, which is the big conference for academic work on science fiction and fantasy. And Howard for many years was not really a part of the academic conversation the way some of the other writers you may be familiar with, like Lovecraft and Ray Bradbury and some of the other writers who began in the pulps and have sort of transcended that medium in popular culture. Howard, unfortunately, had really not reached that level in the academic world, and so there's a number of us, myself and Mark Finn and Rusty, some of the guys that were going to the early PCA conferences in the early 2000s started trying to get the ball rolling on this and making Howard part of the conversation, and that's really taken off in the last few years. Now there's a whole group of scholars that are out there doing this, writing papers on Howard, doing their master's theses on Howard, dissertations on Howard, and it's really starting to take off. And it's a great thing because Howard is such an influential figure in popular culture, in fantastic literature, that he needs to be a part of that conversation. And so one of the things I wanted to do a few years ago is bring to Howard Days some of the work that's being done in academia on Howard, and give you guys a sample of some of the academic papers that are being given out there. Because people hear about what we're doing out there, but it sounds kind of it's weird ivory tower stuff. So I wanted to come here and start and give the fans a little taste of what's been going on. So this is the 3rd annual Glenn Lord Symposium, and this is a chance to get a feel for what's going on. And we have 3 great presenters today that are going to give you some papers. These are papers that are being published in journals and that have been given at conferences. And so I hope you guys will enjoy it and get a taste of the academic side of Howard. How are you? Okay. So we're going to begin with Karen Kohoutek. So Karen, I'll let you introduce yourself. Yeah.
I'm Karen Kohoutek. I'm a member of Rehupa, so I've been involved in this sort of academic thing for a few years. Jeffrey kind of dragged me in. I fled academia.
I'm an instigator.
He is an instigator. I have a master's degree in creative writing, and I did a lot of work with English literature prior to that, and then I dropped out of all that and worked at a public library, and then Conan pulled me back in. So I just do this for a hobby, but I kind of like it better that way. So the paper I'm going to read today is called I Am Mine, Awakening and Empowerment in Black Colossus. And I am doing this old school. I still have a flip phone, so I did not do a PowerPoint. Robert E. Howard's Black Colossus, published in Weird Tales in June 1933, is one of his first Conan stories with a major female character, the Princess Yasmela, the first to feature an identifiable damsel in distress, and the first to contain multiple women in the same story. Although not published until later, Queen of the Black Coast, featuring Belit, the powerful pirate queen who becomes Conan's first love, was written earlier in 1932, so that Belit takes pride of place as the first female character Howard created in Conan's world. But Yasmela was the first to appear before the public, setting the stage for those who would come later. Black Colossus was also the first Conan story to make the Weird Tales cover. Howard's famous hero doesn't appear. Instead, it's Yasmela who's featured, which seems appropriate since it is more her story than Conan's, which can often go unrecognized. The tale begins with a narrative misdirection, focusing on a male character with an active occupation, a famous thief among thieves. And on a first reading, with no foreknowledge, it seems like this character could become the hero. Instead, he ends up awakening an ancient evil and then is swept out of the plot, killed almost immediately. At that point, the focus shifts to a female protagonist whose adventures and point of view will primarily be followed for the rest of the story, meeting up with Conan along the way, so that the reader experiences the action from within the consciousness of the young woman, while Conan is viewed externally. Yasmela is first seen in an archetypal role as a young princess. Where her predecessor Belit seems to have made herself the queen of the Black Coast, Yasmela has a more conventional background, and is first seen within a community of women surrounded by 10 daughters of nobles, some kind of ladies-in-waiting, who sleep around her bed in symbolic protection. She is both privileged and largely sequestered from the world, which puts her in a contradictory position. Because she's a woman, and I'm not doing quotes and footnotes, so I'm so sorry, but this daughter of aristocrats had never before ventured unattended outside her ancestral palace. Nonetheless, the ever-present reality of war means she can no longer be sheltered as she's used to, since in the absence of her brother, the king, the rule of the struggling kingdom is in her hands. She is introduced in a position of weakness, overcome with terror, from a corner of her bedroom, where a vast, shapeless shadow torments her by whispering vague sexual threats. It tells her that, "You are marked for mine. I had marked you and yearned for you. Soon you shall love me." And that is in a bodily guise. At this point, the danger to her all lies in implication, since whatever menaces her doesn't seem to have any actual physical presence. Nonetheless, the supernatural stalker is deeply frightening to her. Many writers view the increasing prevalence of female characters in the Conan stories as largely influenced by commercial concerns. For example, this is from Finn. It's obvious that Robert knew the Weird Tales formula, or at least the piece of the formula that involved a woman, preferably scantily clad. Discussing this story, Patrice Lunet says that the Texans seem to have understood that the sexual elements help sell his Conan stories. This initial scene with Yasmela certainly provides some evidence for that viewpoint, as it gives Howard an opportunity to describe a young woman in some detail, naked on her supple belly, like the most abased suppliant, who lay and writhed in pure terror and moaned in her ecstasy of terror. The connotations of moaned and ecstasy immediately suggest an element of sexual response to what the voice is telling her, although she doesn't recognize it as such, but is only aware of the surface experience of fear. Anything deeper remains in her subconscious. Also, the narrator describes the shadowy threat as a monstrous night-born incubus that might have been deemed a figment of a sleep-drugged brain. An incubus, of course, being an evil spirit, especially one that has sexual intercourse with women while they are sleeping. The voice begins to pontificate in a speech that narrator describes as a stream of cosmic obscenity about how all-powerful the speaking ancient evil will be when it returns from the ancient spell that's kept it asleep as the years passed. Its plan is that while ruling the world, thou shalt be my queen, O princess, with a suggestion of power offered. But mainly he promises to teach thee the ancient forgotten ways of pleasure. These threats are all of things that have the potential to be positive experiences if they occurred in a different context. Yasmela is offered a kingdom and the experience of pleasure. However, it's happening in a way that is horrifying to her, where her own will has already been disregarded, made inside a violation of her personal space, where her own will has already been disregarded. The voice talks to her in the style of a man trying to seduce her, but there is no physical person attached to it. Instead, it's some kind of disembodied force. Like the nature of awakening in general, this scenario can easily be interpreted as symbolic of sexual fantasy, not always invited or welcome, and general sexual awakening. A young, inexperienced person on the verge of sleep is suddenly beset with erotic thoughts that seem to come from nowhere, which is a basic human experience regardless of gender. Finally, one of Yasmela's companions, Vitisa, also wakes up and they discuss how to free the princess from the repeated visits of the shape. It's a realistic touch that a young woman, largely sheltered from the world, would have another woman her own age as a confidant and advisor. Vitisa suggests that Yasmela visit the oracle of Mitra, and the princess readily takes her advice. They go together to the shrine of the god, who is always referred to as a he, a gendered being, where the sinister shape, which we'll eventually learn is the presence of an ancient sorcerer, has been described as an it, an abstraction. In these early parts of the narrative, Yasmela seems fairly passive, even contrasted with her own lady-in-waiting, who snaps nonsense at her when she wants to abase herself before the idol. Her fear and submissive instincts are foregrounded, and there is much description of luxury, establishing the rarefied environment in which she has always lived. She certainly seems pallid in comparison to Belit. It's worth noting, however, that the thief in the story's opening was renowned as an adventurer, and he died screaming pretty quickly, so she actually holds up fairly well for an untrained and innocent maiden. Her tendency towards submissive behavior begins to change, paradoxically, in the very act of supplicating herself to the supposed will of God, Once she's given a direction, she's perfectly willing to brave something crazy to save herself and the kingdom, taking a leap of faith that will draw Conan into the story. When she meets Conan, she is instinctively afraid of him. She started violently when first seeing him with his unconscious swagger in these strange surroundings. She recognizes that there was a wolfishness about this warrior, and she realized her danger alone with the drunken barbarian. He draws his sword, but then sees it was only a woman. There is a clear assumption on his part that a woman is intrinsically harmless, and he calls her my girl and also a hussy patronizingly. In another assumption, he obviously believes that she's a prostitute. In such a gender-stratified society where roles are so limited, her very presence in a public place marks her as such. All of this would have to be very shocking to Yasmela, who is having such an alien experience. She realizes she's completely at the mercy of this stranger. Nonetheless, she's determined, despite her fear, to get him to where she can explain the situation to him. Despite his initial assessment of her harmlessness, Conan is also wary of her. He's quick to suspect that she's acting as bait for possible Confederates to lure him to some den of robbers. But since the wine shops are closed and he's looking for something to do, he shrugged his mighty shoulders. So if Yasmela seemed passive when we met her, now she's the active force and Conan is going along with her. Yasmela has an idea of why he follows her, that he thinks she's a noble woman who, weary of polite lovers, was taking this means of assuming herself, which means that's not unheard of in the court, even by Yasmela, who has hitherto seemed fairly innocent. This train of thought leads to an outright statement that women, especially civilized ones, are drawn to the barbarian in men, and this attraction is obviously sexual. Something breathless and perilous inside her leaned toward him, which is an excellent description, and something deep in her tingled at his touch. The habits of civilization cloak the hidden primitive chord, but can't rip out, and sexual attraction is a primal instinct, elemental and untamed, just like Conan is. Similarly, when she watches his movements, Conan's hands strike her imagination in what is obviously an awareness of his physicality and potential as a lover. With a guilty start, she found herself imagining those strong fingers locked in her dark hair. Where she was earlier awakened from literal sleep by sexual suggestions unattached to any specific physical objects, she is now metaphorically awakening, beginning to realize the reality of her human physical desires. In her position of power as a princess, Yasmela is shown being both submissive and domineering. She's used to men kneeling before her and is attracted to the fact that Conan had never knelt before anyone. While she seems to have led most of her life as a pampered doll, she also longs for vital experience. When the suspicious Conan draws his sword, she faced the infuriated barbarian without flinching. She knows it's a life or death moment, but that reality makes her brave, not frightened. Even more, it makes her feel alive with a certain breathless exhilaration. Her response to the potential violence is intriguing. She says, "Do not be afraid, there is no reason to fear me." In doing so, she flips the situation on its head. The unarmed woman, a dainty princess, faces the sword-wielding warrior and reassures him that he's in no danger from her. As readers, we know that fear on either of their parts is based on a misunderstanding. But in the moment, each has a legitimate reason to be suspicious of the other, and Yasmela's reaction is bolder and more strategic than we might have expected from her in the beginning. Conan tells her what he knows about the condition of her kingdom, and again, she appreciates that, unlike most men, he can speak so forthrightly to her. She responds with practical, clear-headed questions and sounds out the possibility of Conan retreating to the other side. She commits confidently to a plan of making Conan the leader of her troops and decisively tells her advisors that tomorrow we march southward to face their enemy in battle. This transition from a frightened girl to a woman with blossoming sexual desire and then to a real leader, all of which could unfold over a longer stretch of time, is instead narratively shortened to happen in the same night. And we see that her development as a true hands-on leader has been set in motion by that suggestive, threatening whispering in her bedroom. Her empowerment is shown taking place simultaneously on multiple levels. Yasmela surprises Conan by accompanying the army, which he meets with no great approval. But it shows her leadership and inspires the people who cheered wildly when they see her. With the requirement of some verisimilitude, it's not plausible for her to go directly into battle herself, as a prince invariably would, but otherwise, her story operates much like an archetypal coming-of-age adventure. At the same time, despite her increasing strength and authority as a leader, part of her is still only a terrified girl. She must still overcome her psychological vulnerability to the thing that lurks in the shadows, whispering awful secrets. It doesn't matter where she goes, she can't escape it. This fact makes the shadow a potent symbol of the unconscious and potentially the sexuality she hadn't previously thought about expressing. Where she had previously turned to a female friend for comfort and a sense of protection, she now goes to Conan when overwhelmed by these threats. At this point, like an electric shock, a surge of animal vitality swept over her at his mere touch. His presence is literally empowered, as she adds, as if some of his superabundant strength had been imparted to her. At the same time, Conan also grows increasingly powerful within the narrative. Where he started out in a relatively passive position, he is no longer just a barbarian she met by chance. Before long, his associate Amalric is telling him, "You grow sober with authority," and that recklessness in battle was always your particular joy. Conan responsibly responds, "I, when I had only my life to consider." As a character, he is fairly early in his career. When the princess asked, "Can you lead men and arrange battle lines?" he said, "Well, I can try." Then, at her command, he is suited up in proper armor and suddenly has a grim impressiveness. Amalric muses, "I have seen kings who wore their harness less regally than you." Where he was introduced as a mercenary and drunken barbarian roaming the streets looking for wine and women, now a vague shadow crossed his mind like a prophecy. In years to come, he was to remember Amalric's words when the dream became the reality. A contemporary reader, having the whole of his history in print, can know that he is on the way to famously becoming king by his own hand, and here the story specifically states that. And it is Yasmela who starts him on that road, giving him his first opportunity to prove himself as a leader, which plants the seed in his mind. As the battle nears its bloody conclusion, Conan had forgotten the princess, and the evil sorcerer snatches her up in his magic chariot, a scene which adds to the story's general sword and sorcery fairy tale tone. It was like the rush of a nightmare through a horror-haunted dream, a statement which provides a thematic link to the unconscious, with its dreams, nightmares, and impulses that lie under the surface of the waking mind. This leads to an amazingly archetypal scene, a naked girl tied to a sacrificial altar. The motives of her persecutor, the ancient godlike sorcerer Thugra-Khotan, are somewhat murky and even confused, which doesn't seem entirely inappropriate for the villain in a psychosexual drama. He claims that lust for a woman had weakened his sorcery, and we don't know enough about his powers to understand how this works. How did he know about Yasmela in the first place, to be overcome with lust by her? Why should it weaken him? And does he seem particularly weakened at this point? It's an odd throwaway line suggesting that sexual desire is a distraction from his purpose. Since he's been asleep for 3,000 years, an awakened libido might be part of the process of coming back to life, like any other mighty hunger might be. In a way, he's substituting her soul for her body, abstracting his lust, which is at least human, into a lust for power. At any rate, sexuality, represented by his lust, is shown here as potentially invigorating, but also possibly debilitating. The author described the story's conclusion in a letter to Tevis Clyde Smith, saying that it ends with a sexual intercourse instead of the usual slaughter. He elaborates, "My sword wielder grabbed the princess and smacked her down on the altar." This is definitely an example of macho posturing for a male's friend's benefit, since this is not at all the way the story plays out on the page, where it is more the other way around. After quickly, anticlimactically killing the posturing ancient sorcerer, Conan takes Yasmela off the altar, and then, when she embraces him, she would not let him go. His immediate concern is for the battle that is still going on outside, and he demands, "Crom's devil's girl, loose me." Lune refers to a previous draft not included in this volume in which Conan successfully rebuffs these advances, getting back to his troops. That would be a more responsible thing to do. But, as published, Yasmela's story wraps up more conclusively. After all she's been through, she becomes the sexual aggressor, as barbaric as he in her fear and passion, dramatically saying, "I am yours by fire and steel and blood. You are mine. Back there, I belong to others, but here, I am mine and yours. You shall not go." Just as Thugra-Khotan's lust might have been a side effect of the revived life force, so again, in a more positive way, do we see Yasmela react to a near-death situation with an infusion of libido, with sexual expression as a manifestation of life and vigor. Brought back to life from the brink, she casts aside all convention to give in to her instincts. Conan himself will have a similar reaction at the end of a later story, The Pool of the Black One, where his female companion in that story will ask, "You think of kisses at a time like this?" and he will roar a response, "I think of life." It's significant that her roused passions make her barbaric, a hint at one of the things barbarism can represent in these stories, elemental, unself-conscious sexuality. That's certainly not the only aspect that barbarian stands for, but here it's clearly part of the package. In civilized people, the instincts may be veiled and repressed, but they're still there, looking for a way out. Yasmela acts out here a gender reversal of a trope familiar from the action-adventure genres. Nearly every James Bond movie, for example, ends with the hero rewarded by sex, with a woman who's been in some way a partner in the adventure. This is Yasmela's story, and Conan is her Bond girl. She's been through hell, and at the end of it, she claims Conan as her reward. Yeah. Yasmela's boldness here is linked to her regular status as a princess. Back there I belong to others, here I am mine. She declared that she and Conan mutually belong to one another, but her statement that she is yours is an addendum to here I am mine. She's making a point about her freedom to follow her desires, not sublimating her will to Conan as his possession. In emphasizing I am mine, she is recognizing that she belongs to herself, which she won't lose by having sex with him, rather acknowledging her sexual desire for him as part of her ownership of her own life and her own body.